Welcome to this Fathom interview. I'm Omer-Jackaman, Deputy Editor of Fathom. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Toby Greene. Toby is a visiting fellow in the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics and a lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at Ilan University in Israel. He's the author of Blair, Labour in Palestine, Conflicting Views on Middle East Peace After 9/11, and he's also a former Deputy Editor at Fathom. Welcome, Toby.
Thank you very much, Jack. Nice to speak to you.
So we're going to talk about two papers you've written along with Professor Jonathan Rynhold at Ilan for the Begin Sadat Centre. The second is a more recent paper dealing with the conduct of the war and some suggestions for better policy. But the first we're going to focus on chiefly and that we'll start with. It was written just after October 7th, and its subject is an Israeli strategy for a post-Hamas Gaza. I mean, I'm particularly interested in how the intervening 6 months have changed your perceptions, and just as interestingly, whether despite all that's happened, your perceptions haven't changed that much and the conclusions remain the same. I should say for viewers that I agreed entirely with the arguments made in the paper. So to ensure an interesting discussion, I'll be role-playing a skeptic at times. We're going to assume for the purposes of this conversation that there will be a post-Hamas Gaza, though your paper does allow for the possibility that Israel succeeds in degrading Hamas militarily, but not in toppling it. Yeah. Something that may well come to pass unless an operation in Rafah proceeds. You wrote in the paper, quote, Israeli interests are best served by establishing in Gaza PA-linked administration alongside a massive reconstruction program backed by the US and other international and regional actors that share Israel's basic interests there. Go into that a bit for us and clarify what you mean by a PA-linked administration.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thanks for having me on to discuss these issues. And before we kind of get more into the specifics, I think it's important to stress that the point of the paper, we published it, just a couple of weeks into the war. It was still October, the overwhelming concern that we had at that time was that Israel had declared military goals, but it had not declared a clear political goal. It had not said what kind of political outcome it sought at the end of the conflict. And at that time, it was really very, very difficult, I think, for Israelis to focus on that point. But we certainly felt that for Israel to succeed militarily, its military goals had to be tied to clear political goals. And just as a general point, because obviously a lot of the viewers for this discussion will be kind of people outside of Israel. Myself and Professor Rynhold, we're always trying to think in both the papers that we published, how can we make the case for the things that we think are important and right in terms that are for an Israeli policy audience, in terms that of Israel's strategic interests, because those are the only terms that really matter for Israeli decision makers right now. So the overall argument that we were making was, if you want to get rid of Hamas, you need to, there's clearly a military component that's central to that, but you also need to have a vision of what you can replace Hamas with. And of course, none of the options are good, but if you don't want Hamas and you don't want endless Israeli occupation, then you need something else. And of the options available, obviously, the only ready alternative is the Palestinian Authority. But of course, the Palestinian Authority, as we all know, suffers great deficiencies, is very weak, and has really lost all credibility with Palestinian people. So the question was, how can we, even though it still has it's still the only kind of internationally recognized and supported option, and of course it still has a lot of ties and involvement and has had even over the last 10 to 15 years in the governance of the Gaza Strip. So you have to start somewhere. It's difficult to see how you can build something that doesn't involve the PA or doesn't have the support or engagement of the PA, and that you have to find something that isn't weighed down with the PA's kind of toxic legacy and reputation. So that was really the starting point. How do we get to a Palestinian civilian governance in the Gaza Strip that has international legitimacy, but that can get away from the failings and poor reputation of the Palestinian Authority?
Thanks, Toby. I mean, you mentioned that at the time you wrote, the political question was being rather ignored, and we might say naturally so at that time. I mean, the US criticism frequently has been that it hasn't really developed much in the 6 months since in too many Israeli circles I mean, would you share that? Do you think
Yeah.
there's still a failure to look the political question in the face?
Yes. We were not the only ones saying the things that we were saying right at that very early stage. I think we were among the first to say these things in Hebrew, and our paper was published in English and in Hebrew, really directly at an Israeli policy audience. It is, and it is, I think, a real problem that even now, 6 months on, Netanyahu and his government has not clearly articulated what kind of political future it sees for the Gaza Strip. Now, however, in the Israeli political discourse, and already for several months, everybody's asking the questions that we were asking in October. What about the day after? And this is the kind of the buzzword in the Israeli discourse, the day after. And there is huge frustration across many facets of the say policy-making environment and the political discourse in Israel that the Netanyahu government has not articulated a clear plan. And I think there's a broad assumption and broad understanding that has a lot to do with Netanyahu's personal political predicament, and that he is constrained by the far-right elements of his coalition. And those constraints also link to Netanyahu's personal predicament, the fact that he is on trial, and that greatly narrows his political options. So yeah, I think that criticism is very, very justified.
Thanks, Toby. I mean, to return to the sort of best case post-Hamas Gaza that you kind of envisage, you and Professor Rynhold call for this new administration to ensure Hamas and other jihadist groups, quote, can never return. The paper doesn't go into detail about the kind of reforms of the PA that you envisage, but I mean, I assume you've already mentioned really that you would agree with the Biden administration, in particular, that reforming a corrupt and unrepresentative institution is necessary. I mean, given that the Palestinian Authority and Fatah in its current form still calls Hamas its brother, has still not really clearly condemned its Hamas's massacre, and not long before October 7th was holding reconciliation talks with Hamas. How confident could we be, and could we expect Israelis to be, that even a reformed Palestinian Authority will be effective in ensuring Hamas can't return?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important and challenging question. I don't think anybody really envisages that any actor can do the work militarily in terms of degrading and dismantling Hamas in the Gaza Strip other than in the state of Israel. And the question is, how do you bridge between that military dimension to a future stable political order, which can have, the essential legitimacy from the population in the Gaza Strip to make that sustainable. And yet, I mean, it's hugely problematic. The Palestinian Authority's ambivalent response at best to October the 7th, its continued support for violence and extremism in terms of, for example, its payment of salaries and stipends to convicted terrorists and all the rest of it. And I think there's wide international recognition that the Palestinian Authority must be substantially reformed, both in terms of its approach to incitement and its support for violence, and in terms of its governance capabilities and getting away from corruption and all the rest of it. There's no underestimating the scale of the challenge there. And of course, for Israelis, the biggest problem with making the case for a reformed, revitalized PA governing the Gaza Strip is deep skepticism among both Israelis and Palestinians about that. The question, of course, and I guess the argument that comes out of our paper from way back in October, and it hasn't really changed, is you have to choose between the alternatives that you have. If you don't want continued Hamas rule and you don't want permanent Israeli occupation, then you have to work with what tools are available. The Palestinian Authority has lost all credibility, but it's not always been this bad. There have been periods in the past where the Palestinian Authority, particularly when Salam Fayyad, for example, was its prime minister, where we saw significant improvements in governance and in other aspects of the PA's functioning. So we should not assume that this is doomed to failure. It requires, but to succeed, I think it requires an alignment between Israel, moderate Palestinians, moderate Arab states, and international supporters, particularly European states and the United States and Great Britain as well, to align around a vision of what kind of future we want to see, and then those partners can set about putting in the structures in place that will enable the PA to improve, to reform substantially, and to succeed. Of course, ultimately, the Palestinians are going to, have a massive responsibility there as well, and a huge weight of a burden falls on them, and they have to address their own failings. But from Israel's point of view, it needs to try and figure out how it can create the conditions for the PA to succeed, because you need an alternative to Hamas.
That leads on very, very neatly to the next question, Tommy. And let's look backwards to some of those better periods to look forward, hopefully, to other ones. You write in the paper that the international community should be actively, quote, cultivating a technocratic Palestinian leadership in Gaza that can re-establish the bottom-up institution building model associated with Salam Fayyad, who you just mentioned. Now, it's a bit of a kind of fathom mantra that Fayyad can never be mentioned too many times, and the sort of tragedy of his political fate is something that we return to again and again. It might be helpful for viewers if you could relate for us quite why Fayyad was so different, quite why the path he embarked upon but was not allowed to finish was so impressive, and why that's the path we need to get back on.
Yeah, look, I think it's important to be realistic. Fayyad was, I think, always much more popular, among kind of, Western policymakers than he was among the Palestinian public. But what gained him a lot of credibility internationally, and to some extent, I think, among Palestinians also, was his approach was to focus on the bottom-up state building processes, how to build the infrastructure of a Palestinian state, albeit under the constraints of occupation, and that contrasted with the agenda of the Palestinian president at the time, Mahmoud Abbas, who had an agenda to try and secure secure recognition for Palestinian statehood in international forums, so a much more kind of symbolic way of putting pressure on Israel. Whereas Fayyad was bottom up. How do we actually build a Palestinian state on the ground to get ourselves into a situation where we're ready to govern ourselves effectively? And he made a lot of progress in terms of governance, economic management, dealing with corruption, and also security. Those contrasting approaches were part of the clashes that ultimately between Fayyad and President Abbas that ultimately led to Fayyad's resignation. But I think it seems to many people that a key component of getting from here, where we are now, to Palestinian statehood is credible bottom-up state building institutions, albeit there needs to be also clearly a framework of an international an agreed international diplomatic goal, a credible diplomatic path towards a Palestinian state, and these two things need to work in concert. But I think certainly for Israelis, it was impressive to see a Palestinian that seemed really focused on building a Palestinian state on the ground, as opposed to trying to isolate or delegitimize Israel in international forums.
Thank you, Toby. Another aspect of the paper, you wrote, quote, Palestinian regional international support for the process will be enhanced if Israel commits to supporting the PA not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank. This includes through a reaffirmation of the two-state solution and practical steps to reinvigorate bottom-up state building, possibly linked to normalization with Saudi Arabia, end quote. You envisage this two-state solution coming about in stages, quote, an incremental process to build an internationally backed Palestinian state that will be committed to peaceful relations with Israel, end quote. You conclude that, quote, it is clear that not only does Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish and democratic state depend ultimately on a two-state arrangement, but its security depends on empowering non-jihadist Palestinian politics. I mean, to play the skeptic or the devil's advocate, this argument has kind of underlying assumption that a two-state solution providing for a secure Israel remains viable because there is a moderate Palestinian leadership to be had. able to lead a moderate majority of Palestinian society. Um, a skeptic would say that even if in theory one can hope for such a leadership and people generations from now, that it's just polls and other indicators indicate we're not there. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so again, referring back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of, when myself and Professor Rynhold are writing these papers, we've been thinking about, communicating to an Israeli policy audience, what are Israel's long-term interests? It's in Israel's long-term interests not to be ruling over 2.5 to 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, to ensure Israel's long-term future as a Jewish and democratic state, to ensure Israel's long-term international legitimacy, and to create the basis for building a regional security and a political alliance with moderate Arab states in the region that can counter the threat posed by Iran and its proxies, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. And so if these are Israel's long-term interests, how can those be pursued? How can they be achieved? The model of a two-state solution, we don't see an alternative. And if you want to exclude Hamas, you need to have a better option to put on the table. Now, of course, one of the key arguments against that is one that you've articulated, is obviously attempts over many years to try and reach a conflict-ending agreement, and those have not been successful, and much skepticism about whether among Israelis, whether there really is a moderate Palestinian partner to build that vision together with. I believe even now that not only that the two-state model is the best chance we have to create a stable political order which has sufficient legitimacy among both Israelis and Palestinians to create stable political order in the long term, but not just that that's the best possible chance we have, but that is realistically achievable in the long run. And one of the reasons I think that is, for many, many years after the signing of the Oslo Accords, we saw among both Israelis and Palestinians steady and consistent majorities on both sides, both supporting a two-state solution. So it's pretty remarkable. People talk about this deeply intractable conflict, that for so many years, we actually had a consensus among both populations about the broad framework for a long-term solution. Now, it's true that when you get into the details, they were not necessarily overlapping. But I think that the decline in support on both sides for a two-state solution has been linked to a decline in hope that that is possible. And if you make credible the possibility of this, then you can rebuild support for that and create again a situation in which a majority of Palestinians and a majority of Israelis actually agree over the long-term vision. And then we're narrowing the scope of conflict to, okay, we have many important details that we disagree on, but we still have a broad shared framework for how we're going to live together in the future. So I do think that that's possible, especially if you put it on the table against the alternatives, which essentially is Israeli occupation forever, or a constant war between Israel and Hamas-dominated Palestinian entity. So I think versus those options, the two-state solution has a chance to regain support among majorities of Israelis and Palestinians. The other key component that's going to make that possible, of course, is strong leadership on both sides. That's currently lacking, but we'll need that. We'll need that also. But there's also huge incentives today, certainly on the Israeli side, and I think for the Palestinians as well, that didn't exist in the past. And that is that regional dimension, the potential for regional integration involving not only the Emiratis and the Bahrainis who already normalized their relations with Israel, but the Saudis. If you think about prospects like the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that the US has been trying to promote, the potential economically, socially for both Israelis and Palestinians from that prospect of regional integration that didn't exist before is really immense. And I think Israelis and Palestinians need to be shown the potential of that as well. And then, critical mass of support can be rebuilt on both sides.
I mean, your point about optimism, hope, is very well taken. I mean, they echo arguments I've made in recent essay in Fathom in which I advocated for US and UK unilateral recognition of the state of Palestine, in part to provide that sense of optimism and hope in a political process rather than an armed struggle that you were talking about. There's been a lot of post-October 7th focus on some of the more shocking headline numbers in Khalil Shikaki's polls, for example. But if do a bit of a kind of deeper dive, you see that, just as you're implying, that kind of the rise in support for armed struggle in the Palestinian territories correlates almost exactly with the decline in optimism for the political process. So we're in entire agreement on the question of hope and optimism. I mean, let's turn now to the second paper that you and Professor Rynhold published, which is called Beyond Humanitarian Aid: A Plan for Gazan Civilians is a Strategic Necessity for Israel. And obviously, this relates very closely to the first, but had the benefit of 6 months of war behind it. Perhaps you can summarize some of the arguments you make in that paper for us, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. I will. I will just say I think we do generally agree on most of these issues. I think that where I would disagree with you is on the question of moving promptly towards recognition of a Palestinian state. Although I can understand the strong motivation for doing that. I think that this is one of the key diplomatic cards that international third-party actors have to play. I think there has to be thought how to play it strategically and carefully as part of a broad sequence of measures that build towards a Palestinian state and not to be squandered. And I think I may slightly disagree with you on
You're
that.
quite right. Our agreement is over the need for optimism and hope, not necessarily in the means for providing. That's true.
Yeah, but turning to the second paper, so the second paper we published nearly a month ago now, and the central argument was first of all, because the Netanyahu government had not done what we had suggested to do, which was to articulate a clear vision for what a post-Hamas Gaza Strip would look like, which would, we had argued in the first paper, also bring legitimacy to the military operation. So because Israel was not linking its military operation, even 5-6 months in, to a clear political goal, and also because of the catastrophic humanitarian situation, Israel had basically exhausted the legitimacy that it needed internationally, and particularly with the key partner, which is the United States, to continue its military operation, including in the Rafah area. And as a result of that, Israel was losing leverage against Hamas in the hostage negotiations. So rather than the humanitarian catastrophe increasing pressure on Hamas, it was increasing pressure on Israel because it was restricting the legitimacy and support Israel needed to put military pressure on Hamas. So we argued that Israel needed to, first of all, do the thing that we said it should do in October, which is articulate a clear political goal alongside its military goals, but also do maximum effort to address the humanitarian crisis inside the Gaza Strip. And this would help restore legitimacy to Israel's military operation and enable it to restore the military pressure on Hamas with a credible threat of operation in Rafah. That would help also with the hostage negotiations. I think, to be honest with you, we came too late with this argument. And not saying that we would have had any influence had we made the argument earlier, not to suggest that we have any influence in particular, but I think that what we were saying needed to be said, much earlier. And the truth is, for several reasons, the humanitarian situation got so bad, and also with particular devastating incidences like the death of aid workers in a mistaken Israeli airstrike and other factors. Israel has been compelled to do much more on the humanitarian front. Israel was already coordinating with humanitarian agencies, and of course, it's important to stress, and we make it very clear in the paper, we consider the overwhelming moral responsibility for the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip to lie with Hamas ultimately. But it was clear, we felt that there was more Israel could do, and it's now clear that Israel is doing more, and there is a lot more aid going in. But that's happened under international pressure rather than Israel really taking the initiative, and also Israel has been, blocked really by its US ally from moving into Rafah, and these two things taken together have reduced the pressure, reduced the leverage that Israel has over Hamas. Since humanitarian aid is no longer really a kind of card in the hostage negotiations, and again the threat of military action in Rafah is reduced. So this kind of leaves Israel in a rather weaker position, and it's not exactly clear where Israel goes from here, though it seems that Israel is now trying to negotiate again with the United States over how to operate in Rafah, linked to also questions about how it responds to Iran. And these things, of course, very much in flux right now.
Thank you, Toby. I mean, first of all, I think it's certainly not too late to publish that paper. It had very important things to say that remain sadly relevant. But I mean, if I can do a little kind of internal Fathom promotion, Alan Johnson and I wrote, within the first week of this war, when Defense Minister Gallant at that time announced the siege on Gaza, that doing all within Israel's power and within the frames of international law and operational necessity to protect the Gazan civilian population was not only a moral imperative, but it was also a strategic imperative too. That Western diplomatic support would erode at a tremendously quick pace if that was not done. I then made a similar argument again around December time when I didn't feel that was being followed. You're over here in the UK now. Do you think Israel, both on a general level with the government in particular, has a kind of full appreciation of the levels of negative Western perception on this score? How those perceptions might inform, or perhaps already have informed, those countries' policies? Does the government understand this, do you think?
I mean, first of all, I think we should say, and we acknowledge it in our paper, that we don't suggest for a moment that any of these questions are easy, and all of these issues present very, very real dilemmas. There are many in Israel who will say, the more aid you allow in, if you're allowing in electricity, if you're allowing in food, if you're allowing in resources, that a significant proportion of that is going to Hamas, and you are extending the survivability of Hamas and its ability to continue fighting. And that dilemma is very real. And our argument was that on balance, the cost to Israel's legitimacy of not maximizing aid into the Gaza Strip outweighed the benefit of depriving Hamas of those resources. But we acknowledge, for Israeli decision makers, these present very, very tough dilemmas. Also domestically, in terms of domestic politics, they present very tough dilemmas as well. So we acknowledge the difficulties that Israeli policymakers face. In terms of your question, do Israelis understand, what has happened reputationally over the last 6 months? I think the answer to that is no. That was another purpose of the paper, the second paper that we put out in March, certainly from my perspective. And it's interesting, I'm based in London, although visiting Israel regularly. My colleague, Jonathan Rynhold's based in Israel. It was very important for me to work with somebody who's in Israel and to try and figure out how we could bridge these gaps in perception, because that's something that's been of deep concern to me. I follow these events both through Israeli media, but also through international media, and you can see just the enormous gulf in perspectives. And it was important for me to try to help an Israeli audience understand the damage that's being done reputationally that could be long-term also. And that's another reason why we were making the case that Israel has to both make maximum effort to address the humanitarian issue and articulate an internationally acceptable, or align with an internationally acceptable political vision for the long term, because of that deep reputational damage. The images that are that are seared on the minds of people who've been following this conflict, and that's been shown day in, day out on the international media, images that bluntly Israelis don't see, or see much, much less of through Israeli media. So that there is a significant gap, and it presents a long-term challenge.
Toby, thank you very much. There's much that our readers can learn from a deeper engagement with both of these papers, and we'll provide links to do so do so in this video. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. These are there are issues that remain, as you say, thorny policy questions. But you and Professor Rynhold have certainly added a great deal to the discussion. Thank you very much, Toby.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.